All right, go for it.
Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon. Good evening. Wherever the heck in the world you are, it's the one and only V, the Guerrilla Economist, coming to you with my main man, London Paul, on the Sirius Report. Folks, check it out, thesiriusreport.com. Join the membership. Okay, I've gotten email reviews from people who've been to Paul's site, who are part of his membership base. They love it. For less than the price of a Starbucks latte per month, $4.75 per month, you can get on board a daily intelligence briefing from Paul himself, as well as a whole bunch of other exclusive content on the SiriusReport.com. We love the Sirius Report. It's vital, especially in this crazy, crazy world, to get a really good, proper geostrategic synopsis of what the heck's going on globally. SiriusReport.com. And with that being said, Paul, how's it going, buddy?
Well, good morning, V, and good morning, afternoon, evening to everyone listening. Yeah, I'm fine. Just another boring weekend in the world of geopolitics. Nothing really happened, did it? So I have no idea what we're going to talk about today.
I have no idea, Paul. I mean, I think the World Cup could be a news that we can talk about. Where else we could talk about? Other more important, more pressing news this morning. Um, let's see here. What? Maybe we could talk about what's your London's mayor, the mayor over there in London, Shahrukh Khan or
Oh,
Samir Khan
Sadiq
or
Khan, yeah,
Sadiq Khan.
yeah.
That's it.
Do you know what? I
Shahrukh
can
Khan
barely
is
remember because I have such a complete lack of interest in mainstream politics. Do you know what? I had to struggle for a minute to even recall who the guy was. I mean, I honestly, do you know what? I have no idea what happens in terms of mainstream politics in the UK because I just don't pay any attention to it, unsurprisingly. But, jokes aside, yeah, there's plenty to discuss. I guess let's start with, unsurprisingly, with Syria. Now, obviously, some of this is kind of standard information, but it transpires. I mean, the Israelis have yet to comment on this, which I think is pretty telling because you would have expected them to come straight out and say, well, yeah, we were responsible. But it's alleged, or it's supposed to be confirmed, I think, by the Russian Ministry of Intelligence or whatever, that two Israeli F-15 fighters targeted Syria's T4 air base in Homs, and apparently they fired 8 missiles. 5 of them were shot down before they hit the airfield. Now, probably one of the most interesting aspects of that is the Israeli aircraft didn't enter Syrian airspace and they launched the strikes over Lebanese airspace. Now, of course, we know the reason they won't enter Syrian airspace is because the Russians will shoot them out of the sky, and they've already been warned about this. And of course, yeah, the Israeli embassy also in Moscow didn't comment on this Russian Defense Ministry's report. Now, the interesting, of course, is to which sort of substantiates these claims is the Israeli reconnaissance aircraft was airborne during the attack on the Syrian base. So that's another indication. And by all accounts, I mean these missiles crossed Lebanese airspace and headed towards Syria. Now, imagine for a moment if for some reason they malfunctioned and these missiles actually landed in Lebanon. What could it, I mean, who knows what the hell that could have kicked off. Obviously, immediately, interesting, of course, Washington came out in a blind panic, going, "We don't have any complicity in this strike. We're not conducting airstrikes in Syria. Oh, but by the way, we're closely watching the situation and support the ongoing diplomatic efforts to hold those who use chemical weapons in Syria or otherwise accountable." I mean, this was a big climb down because the one thing Washington didn't want was for anything to be attributed towards them. Why? Because only recently, what did Russia come out and say? Look, if you attack Assad's forces, you're as good as attacked us, and we will respond, in kind. They've warned them. It's rather like what happened in North Korea. They said to the Americans, if you launch a preemptive strike, the Chinese and us will sink your entire fleet to the bottom of the South China Sea. And people at the time said to me, this is rubbish. There's no way that was said. Well, why was no military action ever taken in North Korea? For precisely that reason. And of course, you've got France who've been puffing their chest out with regards to northern Syria, who were terrified also, as well as being suspected of being involved in the attack, and immediately came out and denied any responsibility. Now, of course, it's the usual backdrop. This came after, within 10 seconds of an alleged chemical weapon attack in this militant-held town of Douma. Admit, militant-held, not something that was held by the Assad forces, or there was no one present there whatsoever. No, it was militant-held. Now, of course, they all came out accusing the Syrian government of orchestrating this attack. Now, the obvious question straight off is, why a matter of days after Trump says we're leaving Syria, would Assad launch a chemical weapon attack on his people, knowing full well that it would immediately make the US go, well, perhaps we won't leave now? The only people who benefit from launching this attack is not the Russians, not the Iranians, not the Syrians, only those who wish the US to remain there. And of course, who would be responsible for that? Militants, or Daesh terrorists, as we probably should refer to them. Right. Now, obviously, the question is, was there even a chemical weapon attack? Because what's interesting is the medical teams in Douma said not one person came in with any evidence of any chemical weapon attack. So all we've done, apparently, the only person who or organisation who claims there was an incident was the White Helmets, who incredibly, whenever there's a chemical weapon attack, I don't know, they must have a great sense of smell, but be immune to chemical weapon attack, always are present when these alleged attacks happen. I mean, the interesting thing is attacks were thwarted in East Ghouta recently. And funny enough, the White Helmets just happened to be in the location around the time. Incredible coincidence, of course. It's just, there's no correlation between the two things whatsoever, as we all know. Now, from my perspective, the question would therefore be, what's the rationale behind this? Because the strange thing was when Trump came out with his comment referring to Assad as this animal. Now, on the face of it, it seems staggering that Trump wouldn't spot the coincidence, given his announcement on planning to leave Syria, and suddenly this alleged chemical weapon attack. Now, on the face value, you might say, well, is this some kind of provocation towards Russia? No. And it may sound incredulous to actually believe this, but it's pretty likely someone sat down with Trump and literally managed to convince him that there was legitimate intelligence that stated that, Assad was behind the chemical weapon attack. And obviously, because as far as they're concerned, Assad and Russia are in bed together militarily, therefore Russia is complicit as well. And you can guarantee they will have convinced him, even though he would have sat there and gone, well, hang on, there's no logical reason for this. But this is how it works. They will just present all the information, put all the pressure on Trump, and make him convinced that it was done by the Assad government, even though there's not a shred of logic or sense to why he would do this, which is why he came out denouncing this mindless atrocity, which he said was a humanitarian disaster for no reason whatsoever, and accused Russia and Iran of bearing responsibility for the incident because, as we said, they support Assad. Now, and then, so therefore you start to go, okay, let's set the French aside, who are just trying to appear tough and supportive of Washington. And I mean, it's so ridiculous when Macron actually said that Paris might consider unilateral action, including a military strike. I mean, seriously? It's just so ridiculous.
Paul, you're familiar with that joke that says that every time the French politicians do the Bastille Day parade and the army comes in through the Arc de Triomphe, that the politicians see that and they automatically raise their hands in fear, and then they realize, oh wait, it's our army.
Well, it's just ridiculous. So, of course, what the Russian foreign ministry comes out and obviously denounces the allegations, and they've actually now started to coin the fake news narrative, which of course it is, and says it's baseless speculation, which of course it is, because you can't know within within an hour of this alleged chemical weapon attack. Oh, it was definitely a chemical weapon attack, and it was launched by Assad. And bear in mind, Moscow had telegraphed this, and the Syrians, because they'd stated in the UN, look, we know there was false flag chemical attacks being prepared in recent months. I mean, when the militants abandoned areas in East Ghouta, they left chemical weapons factories with raw materials there, which, you know, the Russians and the Syrians produced and showed the evidence. Of course, there's complete flat denial and an acknowledgement there's any reality to this, but because, I mean, the one thing Assad would do if he was so guilty is start telling the world they found all these chemical weapons factories in East Ghouta. I mean, you just keep quiet and say nothing. But of course, that kind of logic goes out the window. And of course, the Syrian Foreign Ministry and the Russians have rightly pointed out that every time there's any muttering of the US leaving or considering reassessing their position in Syria, these chemical weapons attacks happen. And also, every time the Syrian army makes some major advances in its fight against Daesh, which East Ghouta is probably the last stronghold left that they had any presence. So, and of course, this is again just a whole complete coincidence that the West or makes out there's no correlation between any of these events. And the Russian Defense Ministry's Center for Syrian Reconciliation stated, you know, there's absolutely no way this chlorine bomb's being used in Syria's doom. And Russia was said, look, we're going to send in our representative to collect data that confirms the fabricated nature of the statements. Now, the problem, of course, with that is the West immediately goes, well, that doesn't prove anything because you could have got those samples from anywhere, when in fact, the argument is, where's these samples come from that are supposed to be in Douma anyway, when as far as we understand so far, there's absolutely no evidence that maybe even a chemical attack even happened. And what does also is very suspicious in all these situations is every time, like when the US bombed the same airbase literally 12 months ago to the day, it was on the 7th of April in 2017, immediately Daesh launches an offensive in districts around Homs after the missile attack. What's exactly what happened, 12 months ago. So it suggests some coordination. Now, where it starts to get interesting is, okay, we can immediately rush to the conclusion, oh, well, there's some collusion between the US and Israel. Well, I would arguably say no, and for this reason, because last week, nearly a week ago, there was a phone call between Netanyahu and Trump, and Netanyahu was the one who initiated the call, and he was there to try and convince Trump to rethink his decision to withdraw US forces from Syria. And Trump effectively said to Netanyahu, no, absolutely not. We're leaving Syria, and that's the end of it. And of course, the Israeli government and their security establishment is hugely frustrated with Trump's decision to withdraw US forces from Syria. And Israeli officials think that, Trump administration, and this has been Trump's stance, was to say he's only interested in defeating Daesh in Syria. And he's got no willingness, and this was actually stated, no willingness to act against Iranian military entrenchment in the country. So I wonder what the likes of Bolton, etc., might think about that, but that's a whole separate discussion. So the interesting part is the belief from the Israeli side is that America will benignly support our action against Iran in Syria, but the bottom line is the Israelis are on their own, and the US is not prepared to support them militarily. I suppose the attitude that they're supporting is because the Americans will say nothing, which they have. They've not come out and said anything about the Israeli attack. But by all accounts, Netanyahu was too late. He got on the phone and as we said, Trump's made his mind up, and the pullout from Syria is a matter of time. It's going to happen. So you can imagine the conversation between Netanyahu and Trump probably was pretty tense. And of course, the only statement that came out was when Trump reiterated the commitment of the US to Israel's security, and that they'd continue coordinating and on countering Iran's malign influence and destabilizing activity. That's just bullshit, diplomacy rhetoric. I mean, what commitment has the US made to Israel's security? I mean, that would imply, say, Iran attacked Israel. Well, this is never going to happen. No one's going to, breach the Israeli airspace and start bombing them. So that's just hot air rhetoric. And the other thing about coordination on countering Iran's malign influence and destabilizing activities is just straight out Tel Aviv's playbook. So there doesn't seem to be a huge amount of substance to that. So the question therefore came about is, well, okay, there's the notion that this chemical weapon attack happened. And is it just a mere coincidence then that Israel goes in and tries to bomb the airbase at Homs? Is there some correlation between the two? I suspect there might well be correlation. And therefore the ideology is that somehow perhaps then that Netanyahu may convince Trump, well, actually, you're going to have to now stay in Syria because look what's happened. There's no way we can prove any of this or substantiate it, but we can't rule out that this giant coincidence between this so-called chemical attack and then the Israeli attack, that there is no correlation, or there is correlation, but it does seem highly suspicious. But then there's further developments in Israel which I think may be even more indicative of the major problems that Netanyahu has, because there was this groundbreaking migrant deal which was agreed between the UN and Israel, and that was all staged, where basically what was going to happen is the thousands of African migrants were going to be effectively deported from Israel territories and were going to end up and go into other nations. And suddenly that deal collapsed. I mean, there was a big public fanfare about it, and then it collapsed. And Netanyahu singled out an NGO as being responsible for the failure. And he said it was called the New Israel Fund, an NGO that apparently has ties to Soros. And what they were saying is they held them directly responsible for the failure of this migrant deal, as we said, which would have resulted in thousands of African migrants being effectively shipped to Rwanda, because they've been in negotiations with the Rwandan government for 2 years. So they accept these migrants following their deportation from Israel. And suddenly that collapsed. Now, the story goes that this NGO applied pressure on Rwanda, and apparently sources in the European Union. Rwanda kind of collapsed and reneged on the deal and refused to take the refugees. Now, interestingly, Netanyahu's labeled the NIF, which is the abbreviation for the New Israel Fund, as a foreign organization that receives funding from foreign governments and organizations hostile to Israel. So effectively, it appears that an NGO with ties to Soros is trying to be disruptive in terms of internal Israeli politics. And it's alleged that the NIF has called upon all Israelis who fear the threat of Netanyahu to Israel democracy to rally behind the NGO and stand up to the Prime Minister and his policies. They're alleged to have said this is a battle for Israeli democracy and we are Israel. I mean, this is pretty astonishing developments inside Israel, because it would imply that, and it was said to me a while back by someone who is in Israel, that there was a belief that that it was one faction of cabal trying to remove Netanyahu. And there may be some mileage in that statement given the recent developments, but clearly it appears there are moves trying to destabilize Israel and remove Netanyahu from power. And quite possibly this NGO is part of that process. Now, therefore, the question then starts to imply, is this a move by Netanyahu government in Syria because they're that desperate to retain a US influence in the region and try and deflect away from internal matters within Israel itself? Because it kind of suggests, with all these ongoing allegations against Netanyahu and the idea to try and impeach him and remove him from office, it now seems to suggest that Israel itself is extremely unstable, and may account also for why Israel's launched this kind of indiscriminate bombing of the T4 airbase when, I mean, there's no real understanding yet as to why they did it. And the other thing is that the Russians have demanded meetings with the Israelis to ascertain what the hell were they playing at, basically, in instigating this. And most definitely, if they'd invaded Syrian airspace, the Russians would have taken action against them. Because there is no doubt that in terms of Syrian airspace, they're able to map everything very efficiently, and they know exactly what's going on and where it's going on. But of course, when missiles are launched from Lebanese airspace, it's a bit more complicated. But they still managed to destroy 5 out of the 8 missiles. Unfortunately, a number of people were killed, and I think it was 14 or something like that. So it may also be, of course, that there was the idea that the Russians might have got hot-headed and believed it was a US-led strike, and then had some asymmetric response to that and or symmetric response, and it could have started a whole big war up in the Middle East because of a Russian response. Well, if anyone thought that, they must be frankly insane, because the last thing Russia does is act hot-headedly. It would have assessed the situation and understood precisely what was going on. But I think the fact of this breakdown in talks between Netanyahu and Trump is indicative that relationship is breaking down pretty badly. And I think if Netanyahu feels he hasn't got the US support, then what does that therefore mean? I mean, it kind of means that Israel's just left high and dry in the Middle East, and all the fear, whether it's justified or unjustified, regarding Iran and everything else, is just going to play into the Israeli government's kind of mindset going forward. And it kind of suggests that the US isn't going to tangle with Iran, and if it's got any sense, it would know not to do that, because militarily Russia has their back, and economically so does China. So it would be a futile gesture for Washington to get muddled up in any war with the Iranians, and the Israelis simply can't go alone in this respect, and because it needs the support of the US. So it arguably, we have to wait and see. There's all the UN meetings today regarding which is just going to be all hot air rhetoric and nonsense and nothing of any substance particularly, but it remains to be seen the Russian response to this, because there will be a response in some way, shape or form. They're not simply going to let this go. And we witnessed that with the fact that, on Friday, the US laid a load more sanctions against a number of Russian businesses. And the Russians have actually come out and now said, we're going to provide a response to this. So they're not going to let it go anymore. They are, and what that response will be remains to be seen. It's not going to be military, obviously, but economically, the Russians will do it. And you can guarantee if the Russians are going to do something economically, it's in tandem with the Chinese and the ongoing sort of trade tariff debacle as well in the process. So it's very difficult to understand why the US continues, why Trump's under pressure because of this notion of his collusion with the Russians, which if Mueller can't prove anything by now, he's never going to prove anything. But it's like this fear that we always have to be seen to being tough on Russia. But ultimately, this is going to also backfire on the US in the process. I mean, I think militarily they're realizing that there's no way they can risk any confrontation, whether it's in North Korea or in Syria or anywhere else for that matter. But trying to put more and more economic pressure on Russia is going to fail, because it's failed in Ukraine. It's failed for 4 years. So why is it suddenly going to change? There's no sense, no reason to that either. But I think it's just the fact that continually Russia is a major Achilles heel to Trump policy, because they're always having to be seen to be tough on Russia because of the fear factor that if they're not, then someone's going to come out and accuse them of more collusion with the Russians, which of course is utter nonsense and has never been the case.
Tonight the world's waiting Xi Jinping's statements in terms of the situation with the trade the tariffs and whatnot. Paul, what's your opinion on that?
Well, the situation is, from the Chinese perspective all the way along, has been, look, a trade war is ultimately futile. I know there's a number of commentators who are spinning it that somehow the US is going to come out winning out of this. Well, absolutely no one wins in a trade war. And the Chinese don't want a trade war, but they weren't going to sit there and say, well, if you're going to impose tariffs of $50 billion on us, what did the Chinese do? Literally to the very dollar, did likewise, reciprocated with tariffs to the tune of $50 billion. And now, of course, the US is threatening to up the ante and put an additional $100 billion. Well, China will do likewise. The Chinese position at the moment is there is no way we are in any position to have any meaningful negotiations with the US with regard to trade tariffs. So there's no indication that this war, and it is going to become a trade war if it carries on. And yet ultimately people say, well, the Chinese might suffer, but ultimately China is always, rather like the Russians, they know what's coming and they prepare for it. Russia got round the whole issue of economic sanctions and is actually economically benefited from that, rather than the expectation was that they would capitulate economically, and that's just not been the case. So the idea that China somehow is going to capitulate when it's economically a lot stronger than Russia was or is currently, even though Russia's economy has improved a lot, is just a nonsense. And really, I just don't see the point in this, other than the fact that, the argument is that, and there is an element of, I wouldn't use the term 5D chess, but the argument can be, well, if you're going to destroy the cabal, you're going to have to destroy all their industries in the process. So therefore, what you're going to have to do is say, well, if we have all this economic sort of trade warfare together, then it's only going to damage the cabal industries in the process. Well, yes, it might well do that. But in the process, what damage does it do to the average American person who is suddenly going to have to pay an awful lot more for goods? It's also going to affect and weaken an already very weak internal US market in terms of its exports. So it's a gamble if that is the case, but I think that the price, there's a big price to pay. But then arguably, if the dollar's going to get wrecked, then, and the US economy is going to nosedive anyway, then the argument might be, well, what damage is it going to create? But I don't work on the basis that, what if we're going to wreck something? Let's not worry about anything in the process. I think there needs to be a clear understanding, and China most certainly will not lose in this trade war, and they have all the economic weapons, as we know. So it's just, I keep seeing these commentators somehow infer, repeatedly, about how weak China is. Like, China's still this third world nation. China has all this huge debt problems.
Yeah, they do. They have nothing but sneaker and sweatshops, Paul. They have nothing else there. And ox carts.
And the problem is, but there's no acknowledgement of the problems that the US economy has itself, and we don't need to go into that kind of detail.
Perfect, like our foreign policy. It's just perfect.
So you do just have to sort of question this mentality of, and also the idea is, I keep reading things like, well, China's never going to dump all its US treasury. That China has to buy US treasury. No, China has no reason to need to buy US treasuries. And that because they're going up, well, it's all to do with keeping the balance in their own currency. And the thing with the Chinese currency, everyone said 12 months ago, oh, China has to devalue its yuan. Well, it's done the reverse. It's not doing what everyone suggests, because people don't realize it's kind of rotating its economy in the process. So it does things for a purpose, but unfortunately the West remains completely blinkered as to what it's doing. It doesn't understand why it's bought tens of thousands of tons of gold. It doesn't understand what the One Belt, One Road is, and the list goes on, which we discussed many times. But in the process, they somehow seem to think that the US is going to profit from this, and this is a great move for the United States. But on the flip side, you have actually got kind of traditional economists and the people who've defended the dollar, etc., who are in panic mode because they actually go, because they can see the writings on the wall by doing this, so they're not actually wrong in their analogy and why they realize this is a big problem. But I just don't see how this is going to be beneficial to the US or to China in the process. And in fact, in the end, the only winner will be China. And China doesn't want to be a winner in that regard, but they're not going to allow this to go unchallenged, because we're getting to the point now where China will, on the world stage, is going to start standing up and not allowing things. They've had a very benign kind of foreign policy, but they've even started to talk about things which is pretty uncharacteristic for them. And we can talk a bit more about the Skripals in a minute, but that was one example where they just came out and said, this needs to be, this whole discussion between the UK and Russia needs to be done under the auspices of international law, and there needs to be a recognition of proof of who is responsible. And they said it in a very forthright way, and it wasn't just defending Russia, who's obviously their natural ally, but it was to indicate that they're growing deeply intolerant of the insanity that comes out of the West to do with foreign policy. I mean, where it's like everyone's guilty if you're Russian or Iranian or the Chinese or anyone else. You're guilty without any need to prove anything. But meanwhile, in the West, no proofs required about anything.
That's because we're virtuous, Paul.
Yeah,
because
we're beyond, we're beyond reproach, and there's no way that we would lie to the people of our nation, even though
never. We're a democracy. We don't do those things. That only happens in the communistic cabals of Russia and China.
Well, yeah, and of course, this thing is that history continually proves how often Western nations lie to their people. Repeatedly. I mean, once records are declassified, how often do we find the lies? I mean, but apparently, we never lie in the present, but we're always proved to be lying in history. And now we'll prove the case in 50 years or whatever, or maybe probably considerably less, the way the world's going. All these things are going to be proven, and the West's going to have to stand up and explain themselves. But I mean, I think the Skripal thing we spoke about, obviously, when it first happened, and I said at the time, the fallout from this is going to prove to be very ugly, particularly for the UK government. And I noticed the US is kind of backed off and has stopped really talking about it, because I think there was a realization, hang on, this just doesn't make sense. And recent developments make absolutely no sense, because we had accusations that Portland Down a few weeks ago confirmed that Novichok that was used, they said was used to poison Skripal, was from Russia. And then they are now saying, well, we can't prove that. They also stated that there was no known antidote to the nerve agent. So how, on that basis, did Yulia Skripal and now Sergei Skripal make these recoveries? I mean, it just doesn't fit the narrative. And for me, it's increasingly
when those nerve agents attacked, they the evil Russians forgot that Yulia and Sergei Skripal, they had white helmets on. That's why they were immune.
Do you know what? I was just thinking that myself. Yeah. And so there was immediately a whole series of questions with no answers. There was talk that Yulia Skripal wants to return to Russia. So let's get this straight. She apparently wants to turn to Russia, who we are told tried to kill her. I mean, I just can't wait to see how the UK government and authorities try to spin that narrative. Well, she was brainwashed to go back to Russia. I mean, there's no explanation. And if there's no antidote, how could anyone recover? Oh, well, the health services did a wonderful job in aiding their recovery. What, with no known antidote? And then we hear that the US and the UK are making plans to relocate the Skripals to the US, and there's relatives going, they're trying to do this under duress. And then there was this crass incompetence regarding their pets, where I think the guinea pigs were dehydrated and died, and the cat they recovered was seriously ill and ended up having to be put down. And what did they do? Incinerated the cat. Well, surely that would have been prime evidence to establish if there was any Novichok in the house. And here's the question. That implies, did they even actually go in the house? Because logically, if they'd gone in the house, they'd have seen they had pets and done something about it. So it implies either they're completely blind to animals and didn't see them, which I really fail to believe, or they didn't even go in the house, in which case, if they didn't go in the house, why didn't they go in the house? I mean, and the list goes on and on. It's just the most crassly embarrassing situation that you could. I mean, I don't care for mainstream politics. I don't care for governments. I have no interest in what the UK government says or doesn't say. But the way this whole thing's been handled is just beyond farcical, and it makes the UK, well, subject to ridicule around the world, because people are going, the government just lacks any credibility. And what's interesting now is, of course, is that Russia's going, well, you can see they're almost starting to go for the jugular in a quite a polite way. Because what's happened is the deputy Russian prosecutor general spoke about the case surrounding this alleged poisoning. And they're now accusing, obviously, Britain of violating international laws by classifying. And that's the thing they've done. They've now tried to classify these cases and put a lid on them. Well, we can't discuss this because it's a breach of national security. Well, they did the same with Litvinenko and Boris Berezovsky's cases. Now, what they were is, obviously, Litvinenko and Skripal were former Russian intelligence officers, and Berezovsky was a Russian businessman. Now, again, the allegation was that the Russians were involved in all three of those, and the Russians are saying, well, this is based on unfounded accusations. And then straight afterwards, of course, there was demands for sanctions against Russia in all three cases. Now, what the Russians are saying is that Berezovsky was granted an asylum, even though the UK Internal Ministry didn't find any evidence there was any assassination attempt on his life. And then Russia didn't receive any documents concerning the death of Berezovsky and its cause, despite the fact Russia submitted 39 requests to the UK in a period of 5 years, between 2006 and 2011. And the Russian prosecutor general is also claiming that Berezovsky has had some part in Litvinenko's death, and claimed that the radioactive traces were found in Berezovsky's office. Now, of course, the UK may refute that. But for the last 15 years, London refused to expel 60 people at Russia's request. And 55 of these were granted refugee status or asylum in the UK. And what it is why this has come about is because the Russians got so fed up with what happened with the Skripals that Russia's now said, we're going to disclose data about the UK's unwillingness to cooperate on previous, high-profile cases.
Right.
And also, Russia has taken the kind of, the mantle, grasped the mantle, and they're going to make public the correspondence that Theresa May, who's obviously the UK Prime Minister, when she was the UK Home Secretary. And what they're saying is they're going to provide copies of separate documents from relative criminal cases, including correspondence with May during the time, obviously, she was UK Home Secretary. So what they're actually doing is they're now going to say, well, we're going to expose what happened and the developments or the lack of developments with respect to Theresa May, who, by the way, is your Prime Minister. And then, of course, the fact is they're also saying, because the whole case with Litvinenko was this polonium-210, which they said was used to kill him. Now, the Russians are saying that the polonium-210 was in Russia before the Russians accused of poisoning him arrived there. And the thing is, the Russian prosecutors said this was proven by the UK's own data, which it had shared with Germany.
Right.
Now, obviously, the narrative in the case in Britain is that Litvinenko was poisoned with polonium-210 by these two Russian citizens. Now, neither stood trial for the crime, but British officials at the time said there was no other credible explanation for Litvinenko's killing, rather like there was no other credible explanation for what happened to the Skripals. Now, Russian prosecutors showed a document that was issued in November 2006 by the Hamburg City Prosecutor's Office, which contradicted the narrative that was issued by London. Now, what it said is that the conclusions of this German evidence which was collected by Hamburg prosecutors, which was received from the UK, included the tracking of trails of the radiation left by this polonium-210, that the polonium was in London before these Russians arrived. Now, the narrative is that, well, these turned up with this poison and killed this person, killed Litvinenko. And what it said is that the German prosecutors got information from the UK that the highest level of radioactive contamination was found at the London office of Berezovsky, and also there was an Italian citizen, Mario Scaramella, who obviously in his body they found these very high doses. Now, he met Litvinenko, this Scaramella, on the day of the poisoning and was exposed to this polonium-210. So what Russian prosecutors are saying is that the two men had this falling out in 2006, and Litvinenko posed a threat to Berezovsky because they claim he could expose the fraudulent nature of the case of his political asylum, which, according to Russia, as they said, there was no reason for him to be granted it. And they're saying as well that, there's allegations that British intelligence services protected Berezovsky from Russian justice. So we start to see this correlation of events, and now the Russians are coming out saying, well, we've had enough of this, so we're going to start telling the world that information was correlated in previous cases, and the narrative didn't stack up when the Germans had collated or presented their finding based on evidence that the UK provided to them. And therefore the question starts to be, well, hang on, okay, so you're making accusations regarding what happened in the past with Litvinenko and Berezovsky, but here's the point. And if indeed Novichok was used, and they're saying it was on the door handle or left on the door handle with the scribbles, I'd like to see the CCTV evidence that shows someone in full chemical weapon gear. And bear in mind, if you see someone wearing this stuff, they don't exactly blend into the background. I mean, someone's going to turn up at their house and start spreading all this stuff, and nobody saw. There's no evidence. There's no CCTV evidence. Bearing in mind, we have cameras everywhere in the UK. If you drive, you can literally be tagged through large parts of the UK just on road CCTV cameras. So, but there's no evidence of anybody turning up at the house to deposit Novichok on door handles, etc., which is now where they're claiming where they probably was the most likely cause of why they contracted, even though they'd said 7 or 8 other locations, including park benches, restaurants, etc. But ultimately they settle on that. Well, the whole story starts to fall apart, and I have to question: was Novichok even used? Because if it was, which is 8 times more potent than VX, how did though Yulia Skripal and Sergei Skripal survive?
White helmets, Paul.
With no known antidote.
White helmets.
I mean, and
superpowers. Go ahead.
I mean, there's just no kind of explanation for any of this, and yet, the story just falls apart. And the question is, at what point are they going, do the Skripal, well, Yulia Skripal goes, I want to go back to Moscow. What are they going to do? Say, I mean, if she wants to go back, the narrative just collapses. I mean, what convoluted bullshit are they going to come out with to justify that? And then if she goes back, I suppose if she goes back and makes a statement which contradicts what's gone on, they'll just say, oh, well, she was put under pressure by the Moscow government, the Kremlin, to make these statements. I think if she's going to make a statement on this, she needs to make it before she leaves. And therefore, they can't accuse the Russians of putting any undue influence on her. Now, that's not for us to decide what she says or doesn't say, because we don't know what the reality is from her and Sergei Skripal's perspective is. But the whole thing is just it's so farcical. And I don't know what's worse: the fact that the UK government is behaving the way it is, or that the average person in the UK doesn't see the obvious and go, hang on, this makes absolutely no sense. And what we're starting to see, it's kind of like it's a sort of form of McCarthyism, where it's almost like now, well, if you don't believe the official line of the UK government regarding these Russian matters, then you're a Russian sympathizer, or in the case of Syria, you're a Russian and Iranian sympathizer. It's kind of just become farcical, where people are not allowed to question things. And now it's just the blame game. Well, we just blame someone with no evidence. And if you contradict that by presenting some solid facts, which totally trashes the official narrative, then you're branded as something like I say, a Russian sympathizer or whatever. It is just beyond the joke. And I think ultimately the risk is that this is the fallout we haven't yet to see. And I just think that the more the UK pushes it, the more Russian intelligence will start to release information, and the more damning it's going to be for the UK government in the process. And rightly so, because this insanity where the West and nations seem to think that they can just apportion blame to whoever they want to blame it on. And it's just perfectly acceptable that and then when it starts to get uncomfortable, just pull the old, well, this is, a matter of national security and it can't be discussed anymore. That line. It is just so line. It's yeah, and that's what it is. It's just the lamest reasons given, and unfortunately, I think there's too many people who are still buying this lame kind of attitude and approach, and sadly, it's hugely detrimental. But what can you do? I mean, people will believe what they want to believe, but I think increasingly the Skripal case has started to wake more and more people up to the fact that I'm sorry, something doesn't make sense, and we're now seeing the kind of response to this chemical attack where people are saying, well, there's no motive for Assad to do this to his own people. I mean, he's winning. They've virtually won the war. They control 98, 99% of Syria. The war's almost over. The US is basically pulling up the drawbridge and saying we're going home. And yet I'm going to start killing people. I mean, there is zero logic to it. But I do think that is starting to permeate more and more into the minds of people. But all this is indicative of is there's just blind panic in the cabal. They know they've lost, and they're just they're desperate to do anything to demonize Russia, demonize Syria, demonize Iran, and ultimately the demonization of China is happening in an economic sense.
Yeah.
I mean, they can't demonize them militarily because China doesn't do anything in terms of foreign policy militarily. So, I mean, okay, I know someone's going to say, well, that's not the case because they have these border skirmishes with India. Well, that's a border skirmish and is pretty much a non-event, but they don't get involved in military conflicts like in Syria, although they have had some indirect in terms of reconnaissance and stuff like that, but they don't actually play a fundamental role in combat missions in that sense. So, but the demonization can continue, but it's just the narrative is falling apart because more and more of the world's waking up to the reality, and it's starting to spread through Europe as well now, where European nations increasingly are starting to go, I'm sorry, we're just not accepting this nonsense anymore.
I love how all of this is just falling apart. None of this is working. The West has gotten more moronic as the days go by, Paul, and it's just, it's all going to crescendo in an end. I mean, this shenanigans is going to come to an end. It's going to be a point where Russia and China is going to say, you know what, enough's enough. They're going to hit that economic red button, and that's it. We're very
exactly
close to there.
Yeah. Well, I think the point, and that's the point, is ultimately, we've said this for a long time, that the only way you destroy the deep state, the cabal, or anything is the dollar has to be destroyed. Because while the dollar still exists, they have the capability to be able to, they can fudge bond markets, they can fudge stock markets, they can fudge anything, they can. Despite all the contrary indications economically, they can do whatever they like. Once the dollar's gone, they're dead and buried. They can have trillions of Federal Reserve notes. What are they going to do with them? Nothing. And that's the whole sort of basis for this notion of Trump taking the wrecking ball to the cabal, and that's what he was there to do. And ultimately, I suppose rightfully, and the dollar is dying. We know it's dying. I mean, just only I think came out today was we're seeing Japanese investors selling record amounts of US bonds in February, and they've extended purchases of euro-denominated bonds, which which kind of beggars belief, but because there seems to be this big move out of dollars into euros, but they sold around, I think it's about 40 billion US dollars in February. And it was the 5th consecutive month that they've been increasing euro-denominated purchases and decreasing US, bonds. And I think since October, there's been $75 billion of US bonds effectively offloaded. Now, what's interesting is that this is near record amounts of treasuries in February. It's not. But what's perhaps even more interesting is that foreigners hold only 42% now of US debt. That's the smallest proportion we've seen in 15 years.
Yeah, it's huge.
So it's huge. So the question is, well, if 58% of US debt is in the hands of the US, who's bought it? And it comes back to the exchange stabilization fund hoovering up all the US debt that no one else will buy. And we've said this for a long time. The US is not selling debt abroad. The Chinese aren't buying it. No one's buying it. It's just being bought by the exchange stabilization fund to create this illusion of confidence in the dollar. But I mean, if you're now at levels not seen since 2003 and it's down to 42%, then that's indicative of the fact that the US dollar is in terminal decline. And ultimately, this is what it's all about. Once the US dollar dies, and it is going to die because it's long since served its purpose. I mean, it effectively died in 2008, and it's being kept on in the life support unit or intensive care unit for the last 10 years. Well, those days are largely coming to an end. And when is not the issue. It is going to happen. I mean, we're back to this whole event-driven scenario. I get a lot of people getting in touch going, well, all these things are supposed to happen in these months and these months. And there is no time scale on this. And I always say to people, look,
you're wrong. You're wrong, Paul. This is the month that the 25,000 sealed indictments are being released, and they're going to be unsealed, and major arrests are going to happen this month because somebody said so.
Well, the point is, I don't doubt at some point. I'm not saying it's 25,000. I don't doubt we will see adjudication of people. Is it going to happen this month, next month, the month after? The reality is we don't know. And I always use the analogy on dates that a broken clock is always right twice a day. And if you and I could sit here going, well, there's this major events are going to happen in this month or next month. And if we keep saying it, and when it does happen, we'll go, well, we got to see, we told you it was going to happen in this month, without actually forgetting the fact that things haven't happened in previous months. So yeah, maybe things will happen this month, maybe they won't, but I don't think people should be sat there, putting their hat on dates of when things are going to happen, because we've had this history in recent years where dates have come and gone. And do you know what? One of the biggest problems the gold and silver markets have had is because people keep speculating, going, we're going to see another rally in the gold price. There's going to be a rally in the silver price. You're not going to get any rally in these until the paper market eviscerates and dies, because while the paper market still exists, they can manipulate and control the price. We saw it recently with big talk about, it's going to be this huge, rally in gold and silver. And we had a couple of days, and I tweeted going, yeah, it'll probably last till the end of this week or the week after. And then the price will get smashed back down. Well, what is it, down to about 13.25 or maybe a little bit more at the moment? This is going to repeatedly happen because there's no putting dates on these things. People are making an analysis based on TA, which is completely screwed, because the paper market manipulates TA by the virtue of their actions. So it's pointless looking at technical indicators for gold and silver, because, yeah, they may allow gold to rise $100, and then what they'll do is they'll just dump billions of paper contracts and smash the price $50 in a day or in a few, 3 or 4 days, and we're back to where we were. So it's a pointless discussion, and all it's doing is frustrating people in the process. So yeah, by all means, things may happen in April. They may or may not. I mean, at the moment, I'm not seeing any indication that why that would happen. there's a lot of things that are happening. There's a lot of executive orders that kind of suggesting that things are in the pipeline at some point. Yeah, there's the whole idea of the the idea of backing the dollar with gold. My question is, the US has no gold. So how is it going
You're
to
wrong
back its
again,
currency? I
Paul.
mean,
We have
well,
deep storage gold.
I know, but here's the point. Look, there's no doubt that the Trump administration was all for, well, yeah, we can back the dollar with gold because we've got 8,300 tons. Until someone actually pointed out to them, they haven't got any gold. But you know what? Even if the US had 8,000 odd tons of gold, to back the dollar, they would need the gold price to be at $60,000 an ounce. Now, the fact that the US doesn't have any gold means it is in no position to be able to back the dollar with gold. Doesn't mean they can't do it, and there are attempts in the future. But putting in executive orders, or the idea that someone, and by the way, the bill regarding backing the dollar with gold, the last I saw, had no co-sponsors, so it's pretty much a mute thing. It will have some relevance in the future, and at some point, yes, the dollar probably will be, but well, hopefully it should be backed by gold. But there's going to be a huge amount of things have to happen before that becomes a reality. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff out there that is undoubtedly is correct. There is no doubt there are moves afoot, but I think unfortunately there was, without getting into the detail, there was a huge chain mail doing the rounds about multiple points that all these things were happening in the US at the moment, and it landed in my mailbox from someone, and I gave it to someone and said to them, okay, what's your perspective on this? And they came back and go, yeah, there's elements of truth in it, but there's a lot of it's people pulling bits of information together, which is circumstantial, and there's no understanding at this point that there's any substance to the fact that all these things are happening at this point in time. It doesn't mean it isn't going to happen, and it doesn't mean it can't happen quickly. But I'm not, I have no interest in reading speculation. I like to deal with the facts. I mean, someone can give me stuff that, you and I can chew over things that's speculation and say it's speculation, and that's fine, and I don't have any problem with that. But I'm not going to hang my hat on speculation, because I do get people saying, well, so and so said this, or this group of people said that, and I go, well, okay, where's the evidence? And until I see the evidence, I have no interest in it, because I just file it under speculation. Great if things do happen, and at some point things will happen. But it doesn't mean it's going to happen this week, next week, or next month. And this is what bothers me, is people will latch on to things because it gives them hope and belief that things are going to happen, even though they are going to happen. But when they don't happen, then they get very frustrated and very demoralized. So if things don't happen in April, May, June, July, or August, that's just the way it's going to be. Don't get demoralized into it and feel, oh, it's hopeless, nothing's going to change. Yes, it is going to change. I don't have the slightest shred of doubt about that. But it's rather like the reset. The reset is going to be a very complicated process. It's not going to be how people imagine it. And the truth is, I don't think, apart from the Russians and the Chinese, I very much doubt anyone else really knows what exactly is going to happen, how it's going to happen precisely.
Yeah.
We understand elements of it. We don't understand it all. Maybe there is some way this is going to benefit the US in the future in a post-cabal world. But there's no indication of that. Now, you and I could sit here and we could have a great conversation and speculate about it and have droves of people coming to listen, because it's all really, interesting and speculative. Always sounds very, exciting. But there's no point in having those discussions. When it becomes more and more obvious what the granular detail of the reset is, then we can start to discuss it. We know it revolves around gold and silver. There's going to be asset-backed cryptocurrency. We know it involves the end of the unipolar world and the adoption of a multipolar world, and we're seeing a lot of it. We discuss all these things because they're all part of that process, but some of the details not present, and I fear there's no point getting bogged down in that level of detail and then disappointing ourselves and disappointing other people by making these speculations. I mean, and great, if it all happens tomorrow, wonderful. That's what we want to see. the emancipation of humanity and the end of the insanity that's run the world for hundreds of years, that has to come to an end. And this isn't about, one person being right and one person being wrong. But please be careful hanging your hat on things that are said, because if it doesn't happen, it's going to be very debilitating and demoralizing for people. And that's why we just deal with the facts. And yeah, the facts aren't exciting, but at least by doing what we've done and what we continue to do, we're presenting the picture of what's unfolding and the reality behind it. And that's all the only basis by which we can work. I mean,
Exactly.
yeah, we could have a show and speculate, and maybe one day we'll do that. But let's be honest, we will say it's speculation because that's the only way we can approach these things.
Correct. Paul, very, very well said. We're at the end of the broadcast. Great highlights, great points. Again, folks, check out Paul's work, theseriusreport.com. Subscribe. Hit subscribe. Join that membership for $4.75 for less than the price of a venti latte over at Starbucks. You're going to get the entire geopolitical spectrum spelled out to you in detail by the man himself. Again, theseriusreport.com. Check it out. And again, folks, thank you for listening in. Subscribe, hit the like button, and comment. With that being said, we're all said and done. Take it away, CJ.